This excellent session this morning. So formally, I'm delighted to welcome you, both to those who are in the room as well as those, many hundreds I understand, who are joining us online, to this event, Code Red, the role of parliaments in the climate and ecological emergencies. My name is Malini Mehra, and I'm Chief Executive of Global International, a network of parliamentarians founded 30 years ago this year by Al Gore, John Kerry, and their distinguished parliamentary counterparts across the world. And I'm delighted to be chairing this session, which is hosted jointly by the Scottish Parliament, Scotland's Futures Forum, and the United Kingdom Climate Change Committee. I'm also delighted to be in Scotland and in Glasgow, and very excited because this is the most energizing COP I have been to since my first one, which was in 1997 in Kyoto. So well done to everybody who is really lifting spirits and engaged in so many amazing events and declarations, many of which I think will feature in today's conversation. So today's event brings together parliamentarians, advisors, climate justice advocates, and academics to explore how parliaments must evolve in the context of a code red for humanity. And I think with this audience, nobody needs an explanation of why we're using the term code red. It, of course, refers to the sixth assessment reports of the IPCC. Now, this week, we've seen many governments committing to tackle climate change and take action. We've heard an absolute parade of announcements and agreements which have come through the leaders' session from Monday at COP itself. But it will, of course, be parliaments, legislators around the world who will be holding the executive, holding government to account on their commitments. They'll be legislating, they'll be approving budgets, they'll be making the laws, the policies, the legal frameworks, but crucially, they will also be representing the will of the people as the elected representatives of citizens of their countries. So, a number of questions come before us. How can parliaments and their processes be set up to ensure that we meet these 2030 targets? And while we're talking about climate change in the context of COP26, not to forget that, of course, we do have the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2030 targets, which are universal, which are integrated, and which make this entire set of commitments so much more complicated, so much more complex to implement. So what expert advice do parliaments need in such emergencies? Who will provide it, and how will legislators access this? And importantly, what will parliaments need to look like in 2030 to ensure that we hit the net zero commitments in the 2040s? To answer those questions and more, let me introduce our expert panel. I look to my left. And the first panellist will be Dean Lockhart, MSP, who is the convener of the Scottish Parliament's Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee. He was first elected to the Scottish Parliament in May 2016 and was re-elected in May this year. Before standing for election, Dean worked as an international lawyer and business advisor in East Asia. Our second speaker will be here momentarily, and that is the Honourable Charity Kathambi, MP. She's a member of Kenya's Parliament's Departmental Committee on Environment and Natural Resources and chair of the Parliamentary Network on Renewable Energy and Climate Change in Kenya. Charity was elected in 2017 as the first female representative of her constituency, and she also serves as Vice Secretary of the Kenya Women Parliamentary Association. So that's an introduction for Charity in absentia, but as I said, she will be joining us shortly. Our next speaker will be Professor Tahseen Jafry, who leads the Pioneering Centre for Climate Justice at Glasgow Caledonian University. Her research interests include the justice and equity aspects of climate change, gender and poverty targeting, and the psychosocial impacts of climate change. And finally, we have Jenny Hill. And Jenny is the Head of International and Buildings at the United Kingdom's Climate Change Committee, which advises the UK and devolved governments on emissions targets and reports to Parliament on progress made in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Jenny's focus is on fair and transparent policy delivery, including through participative democracy initiatives such as the UK Climate Assembly. And before we start, again, I'm afraid a few practicalities just in terms of how today's session is going to flow. As I mentioned earlier, we're absolutely delighted to be joined by such a large online audience, as well as our guests gathered here today. As you all know, we will be using Slido to capture comments and questions from the audience. We will bring in as many comments as possible, but there will also be a report produced today from today's event, which will include a representative illustration of the event, and this is being produced remotely. The comments, both in person here and online, will feed into the illustration and the report, so please make the time to make a contribution to that. Finally, each of us panelists will speak for about 5 minutes to provide their perspective on the questions that we've outlined. So, to get the ball rolling, and with no further ado, I'd like to invite Dean Lockhart, MSP, to the lectern to share his thoughts on the role of Parliament in the climate and ecological emergencies. Thank you, Dean.
Thank you very much, Malini. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be in Glasgow during COP26. I was at university in Glasgow and have very fond memories of this city. It's a pleasure also to be joining such a distinguished panel, and thank you for joining us this morning, both in person and online. Since June of this year, I've been the convener of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee. This is a new parliamentary committee set up in recognition that climate change is the single most important challenge facing not just this parliamentary term, but parliamentary terms to come. The committee has a wide-ranging brief, one of which is to scrutinise and monitor the Scottish Government's policy and targets towards achieving net zero. And for the avoidance of doubt, for those of you who don't follow Scottish politics, I'm not part of the Scottish Government. I'm an opposition MSP, just in case that has to be clarified, in case you've got any challenging questions about Scottish Government policy. Now, for this morning's session, the conference organisers suggested that we don't do opening speeches, but we do opening provocations. Now, I don't know about you, but 9 o'clock in the morning is a bit early to start provoking people, but I'll do my best. When it comes to climate change and the Scottish Parliament, I think the important starting point is that we have cross-party consensus in the Parliament. We all agree that man-made climate change is real, it's a serious threat to the world, and it's a problem humanity must urgently solve, working together, and that in fact, is the essence of COP26, bringing people from across the world to work together, coordinate and bring best practice to the table. We also agree that Scotland and the UK as a whole have a leading role to play and to set an international example for other countries, and I think we've seen that in the first week of COP26. All parties in the Scottish Parliament have signed up to a commitment to make Scotland net zero by 2045, with a challenging interim target of 75% carbon reduction by 2030. So we are all agreed on the destination. The more complicated question is, how do we get there? The how of reaching net zero by 2045 will involve a huge number of challenging questions. First of all, how do we address, for example, the conflicting demands of security of supply, limiting the cost to consumers, and at the same time limiting the impact on the environment? How do we encourage behavioural change? How do we encourage people to use their car less, use public transport more, especially, for example, in rural areas? How can we best heat our homes, especially given that Scotland's housing stock is amongst the oldest in Europe? And how is this all going to be financed? How can we manage this in a just and fair transition? All of these questions must be answered in the context of a global pandemic with finite resources, with government bandwidth stretched and challenged by that COVID pandemic and the economic consequences of it. There are, of course, no easy answers. Most of the easy stuff, I think it's fair to say, has been done by now. So it's now time for new innovative thinking to address those challenges. So I guess addressing the challenge and the question Malini put to us, how can parliaments evolve to be the public forum for this new, bold and innovative thinking? And here come the provocations. First of all, when it comes to climate change, parliaments and parliamentarians can't just be about scrutiny of current government policy. More importantly, we need to contribute proactively and constructively to new policy development and to offer new solutions. In other words, parliaments and parliamentarians must be policy makers on climate change, not just policy watchers. The simple reality is that climate change is too big a problem for governments to solve by themselves. No government has a monopoly on good ideas. I think the COVID pandemic has demonstrated that the bandwidth and capacity of governments across the world has been stretched and will continue to be stretched for some time, unfortunately. Secondly, as politicians and as parliamentarians, we can't do this by ourselves. We need your help, your energy, your ideas, your freedom of thought outside of the election cycle. Your freedom of thought, your expertise, your energy. By you, I mean academia, experienced professionals, voluntary sector, NGOs, citizens' assemblies, which I'll come on to later, and the private sector. We also need to hear global voices as part of the dialogue. I think developed nations need to see the bigger picture and ensure whatever they do, they pursue global solutions to carbon reduction, not solutions that just displace the problem elsewhere. This includes learning and adopting international best practice. Again, this is something that many of you will see perhaps before it reaches the attention of Parliament. So that open dialogue is going to be essential. Another way in which Parliaments need to evolve is to engage more effectively and frequently with the private sector in meeting the challenge of climate change. Over the past couple of days, we've heard from John Kerry, Mark Carney, even Prince Charles, that there's 100 trillion, I was going to say billion, 100 trillion pounds available of finance globally to meet the climate change. That's a staggering number. Putting that in a context of Scotland, the Scottish Government's heat and building strategy announced last month put an estimate of £33 billion in order to transition buildings in Scotland to be energy efficient and rely on renewable sources of energy. £33 billion for that strategy alone, and the vast majority of that funding will have to come from the private sector. So, and the UK Climate Change Committee has estimated that the UK as a whole will have to spend £50 billion a year in order to reach net zero, with Scotland's share being roughly £5 billion a year. Those numbers are staggering. Those numbers are unprecedented. So we need to really engage with the private sector. We need to involve them in the political and the policy conversation. And I think that's, again, something that parliaments need to evolve and work on better. I think, frankly speaking, in the past, there's been a bit of a gap between parliamentary thinking, policy making and the private sector. I think that's something we need to address. When it comes to the private sector, it's not just the money we need, it's their creative thinking, it's the technical expertise, and of course the cash will help. Thirdly, in my view, parliamentary committees, the engine room of the legislative process, are the best places for this crucial collaboration, dialogue and joint working to take place. Committees are the institutions of Parliament that can act as the sounding board for new and innovative ideas, a platform for the voices of those most affected by climate change, and they act as a channel to government policy. In other words, the unique role that Parliament committees can play is to be the bridge between the sometimes opaque thinking of government and the reality on the ground that you see. I may be biased as the convener of the Net Zero Committee, but I think committees must play an increasingly central role if parliaments are to fully evolve to address the climate change crisis and to enable your voices to be fully heard. Chair, that's probably enough provocation from me, but I look forward to hearing from the other panellists, and I look forward to our discussions shortly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's a fantastic start. Not only were you provocative intellectually, you also offered some guidance on a very proactive role for parliaments to play. I'd now like to invite Tahseen, if you wouldn't mind, as we're waiting for our second speaker still. The floor is yours, and very much looking forward to your follow-up on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and a very good morning. It's an honour and a pleasure and a delight to be invited to speak this morning at this event, the role of parliaments in the climate and ecological emergencies. So, For me, there's no doubt that parliaments have a huge role to play in terms of holding governments to account. And it's very clear, you know, the message of Code Red and what it means for society, particularly the poorest and the most vulnerable people on this planet who are suffering the most. And I think there's some fundamental issues that we really need to think about when we're looking at how we deliver on our commitments to protecting the poorest people. And the things that I want to revolve my short intervention on this morning are democracy, voice and representation. We in Scotland have a huge role to play. We have a strong voice and we have a very unique climate justice fund. And it's so unique that we have that position on the global stage to make some significant voices about what we're trying to address here, the injustices that people are experiencing in the poorest places in the world. So just from that perspective alone, I think that the message is very clear that we're demonstrating our moral and obligation and our duty of care, in a sense, of our role and how we've contributed to climate change over the last decades and what we're giving back now to society. But I think what we need to also bear in mind is that relationship between parliaments and governments. So although we have this very unique fund, I think we don't have all the answers and we don't have all the solutions either. So my thinking here is that perhaps we should be a bit more reflective and critical as to what it is that we're actually trying to achieve and what is our final endpoint, what is our goal, what is our position. And the reason why I say that is because if we are very clear on our ambition, then we'll be in a stronger position to influence other countries, other nations, other governments, other parliaments to follow in our footsteps. But I think we need to get better at getting those messages out there. And this is where the role of Parliament really comes into play here. And I put it to you that perhaps what we should be doing is looking more critically and more reflectively on the evidence that underpins a fund such as the Climate Justice Fund. It's challenging, it's difficult, it's not easy to do, but I think we need to get better at asking some very fundamental questions here. And one of the things that I think is really important is how does this fund link science and development and societal change, because we need that critical evidence base to be able to influence others. And we need to get better perhaps at asking questions around what are our metrics, what are our indicators of impact, how are we going to measure what climate justice looks like, and indeed what does it actually mean to others out there, because we have a certain interpretation and understanding what climate justice means, but it depends on what discipline you're coming from, it depends what area of work you're coming from, and it depends what role you have to play as well. And that brings me to the next point in terms of the role of parliaments. Is there the sufficient capacity within parliamentary committees to be able to absorb the enormity of the subject matter in itself? It is a huge subject matter, and it's not easy to get across. I'm often asked, what does climate justice even mean? What does it look like? And how do we know we've delivered and achieved that change? So on the one hand, we would have a vision and a perspective on that. But what it looks like for people, the poorest and the most vulnerable on the ground, could be something different. So I think what we need to do is to ensure that we have the right frameworks in mind as parliaments to be able to ask those questions. But is it also a question about capacity? Is there sufficient capacity within parliaments to absorb this? And if there isn't, then how do we get that step change into getting that knowledge so that we are better prepared to be able to hold governments to account? Is it about learning? Is it about knowledge sharing? Do we need to have more workshops? Do we need to engage more with different actors and different stakeholders? I think these are very fundamental questions, and if we're able to absorb that reflectiveness as parliaments, then we'll be in a much better position to then hold governments to account. And I think I just want to finish up by posing some more questions, not just on what we're doing with reference to the Climate Justice Fund, but indeed the just transition, because it's upon us to ensure that we transition to a fairer, cleaner, greener economy, but we must do so without leaving anyone behind. And in Scotland, that's so important, because in Scotland, we're made up of a diverse nation of people. We've come from all parts of the world that makes up the societal makeup of Scotland. And I think what we must bear in mind very clearly, that is, if we want to transition in a manner that's fair, it needs to be truly reflective of the makeup of our society, and therefore our policies and frameworks need to speak to everyone. It needs to be truly representative. And I say those words because I sense that I'm not seeing that diversity and that inclusivity and that voice and that representation across many of the conversations that I get involved with. So this is my intervention that I'd like to make this morning. And like I said, I think we have such a huge role to play here, and I think we should really take advantage of all the knowledge and experience and the societal knowledge and information that we have to ensure that we deliver on our commitments, not just with the Climate Justice Fund, but speaking to a fair and just transition. So thank you. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Professor Tahseen Jafry, for those words. I think that you've added a degree of complexity to this with your, which is actually quite interesting as an observer to the debate on climate change in Scotland. I wasn't aware of the Climate Justice Fund. And you've brought out some of the complexities in terms of definitional complexities, in terms of representational and participation complexities of that, especially as we're talking about a whole of society engagement. That whole of society has to be represented in the articulation of the definitions of what we're talking about. So thank you very much for that framing. And finally, I'd like to call on Jenny Hill, please. We're still waiting for our fourth participant, but it may be that we just have to get cracking, and she will join us when she's able to. But Jenny, the floor is yours. And you're going to speak from here or the lectern?
I'll stay seated if that's okay.
Excellent, go for it.
I'm not sure how visible it is, but I'm actually 6 months pregnant, and it's my first COP, so as you can imagine, I've been rushing around, and I've tried to wear sensible shoes, but still, come the end of the day, my feet are rather sore, so I'm very much going to take advantage of the opportunity to sit. Firstly, it's a huge privilege to be here amongst such a distinguished set of panellists. I work at the UK Climate Change Committee, and as you've heard, our role is to advise the UK, Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish Parliament and governments on what the targets should be for decarbonising the country, but also the detailed pathways for getting there, and how to make the country more resilient. And so it's a dual role where we advise on targets, but then we also have a really critical function in terms of annual scrutiny, which we do through a set of progress reports, which are documents which are physically laid in Parliament, though happily on paper now rather than the traditional vellum. So I guess I would like to talk a little bit about our role. I've actually been at the CCC since 2012, which is longer than I ever expected to stay there, but really gives you a sense of just how much I love working there and what a privilege it is to work within that framework. And so I guess just to sort of cover a bit more on who we are. So there are two expert committees, one on mitigation and one on adaptation. And then they're supported by a tiny secretariat, which I belong to, of just 30 people. So largely analysts, but also communicators. And we span different disciplines, so economics, physics. We have people with backgrounds in English, which was actually my first degree before I moved across to environmental technology. And so we really like to look across all the issues, and we're also quite keen of an Excel spreadsheet. So very much fond of our models, and also as Professor Jafry was saying, really keen to have really excellent sets of indicators in place, so we can really track progress in a meaningful way, understand what's going on, and then tune our approach so that it really is the most effective approach, and that also it's an approach which is designed so as to be fair, to be to minimise disruption as much as possible, and to make it as easy as possible for people to embrace this, and to unlock all the benefits that can come with a net zero economy and a resilient economy. So I'll just talk very briefly on some of the strengths and weaknesses that we've seen over the past, it will be 13 years of this framework being in place. So the first thing to say is that the 2008 Climate Change Act was voted in Westminster with the largest ever majority of any act going through Parliament. And that cross-party support has been absolutely fundamental to us being able to become an established voice and a trusted voice. And it is just so important and valuable to have that cross-section of Parliament supporting us and engaged with us, and helps us also to best represent hopefully the full set of people in the country. It hasn't all been a smooth ride, so there have also been a few bumps along the way. One of the tricky issues at the moment is around the costs of net zero. And of course, very much building on what Dean was saying, the easy stuff has largely been done. There's still easy stuff to do, so energy efficiency in homes is an absolute winner. It is tricky in some areas, but there are still really easy things that we can be doing, such as loft insulation, so let's crack on with those. But as we get closer to the net zero target, so the 2050 target in the UK, the 2045 target in Scotland, we really do need to start looking at the tougher things. And so really that's looking at all the sources of carbon emissions, all the fossil fuel combustion, and that includes our gas boilers, and thinking about when we need to start phasing out those technologies so that we can allow for a natural replacement cycle, minimising disruption. And so then working back from 2050 and 2045 in our spreadsheets, that really means looking at the start of the 2030s or earlier for that mass widespread transition. And so that only gives us 5 to 10 years to build up to that stage, so to make sure that we have the skills in place, to make sure that we have the technologies that work, that are as good, if not better, as the things that they're replacing, and that really work for the people that are taking the time to, and in many cases the additional commitments to make these changes. So I guess my career has sort of tracked this challenge, in that my background is as a technical analyst, but increasingly I'm spending my time thinking about these really big questions, such as fairness and how we can do this in a way which, as I said, minimises disruption, minimises cost, but also thinking really about how the impacts will be borne by different cross-sections of society, and I guess, facilitating a conversation about what fairness means to us all. So how, how we can do this in a way which is just. And this is a provocation. One of the things that I've been doing over the past week is launching a new network of international climate councils with a letter that went out to all the heads of state, arguing for the benefits in having independent expert advisors who are reporting to government and to Parliament as part of this legislation-backed process. And so this network that we've launched is 22 councils around the world. There are more which are being set up every year. And it's been such an interesting opportunity to get to understand the different models out there. And so the provocation that I would like to put to you, I've really benefited from learning more about the way that the South African Council has been set up. That's been set up this year. It's the Presidential Climate Committee. And within their remit, they actually have the just transition enshrined in there. And so it's absolutely fundamental to their process that they bring everyone into the discussion. All the sessions that they hold are open. I think that's really a level of scrutiny and transparency which goes beyond even some of the things that I do in my day-to-day. So I guess my provocation is, how can we make ourselves more transparent? How can we bring in more scrutiny? And just to wrap up then, I wanted to touch very briefly on the climate assemblies. I was really privileged to be part of the UK Climate Assembly, which was 100 citizens, or just over 100, coming together. There's also been the Scottish Climate Assembly. Both processes have been absolutely fantastic. And just a reflection from having been involved in that, I think, it was clear to us that it had to be a representative set of people coming together, so they were carefully selected to represent a cross-section of political views, socioeconomic backgrounds, and so on. And the experience of taking a set of people through the evidence and really opening up some of these really challenging questions for them to deliberate on over a sequence of sessions, just really showed that actually I believe everyone has a capacity to get involved in this and to really sort of come to grips with some of the big questions and to add a huge amount of value. So that's where I hope we can all go together. So in summary, I guess, evidence, more transparency, and people power.
Okay, excellent. Evidence, more transparency, and people power. So thank you very much, Jenny. And on that note, I'm delighted to welcome Charity. Welcome to Representative Charity Kutimba from the Kenyan Parliament. And you are our final contributor to this initial set of provocations. So each of the panelists has been invited to share their views for up to 5 minutes. So the floor is yours. If you'd like to join from here or the lectern.
Hope everyone can hear me. I'm okay. Let me start first by apologizing for the few minutes late. I had to move a bit. But I'm Charity Kadhambi Chepkonye, Member of Parliament, Kenya. I'm a member also of Parliamentary Committee, that is Environment and Natural Resources. I also share Parliamentary Caucus, which is on renewable energy and climate change. I'm also in Kenya. I'm also the Secretary for Kenya Women Parliamentary Association. Let me first appreciate yourselves for inviting us to hear the voice from Africa and generally to hear from Kenya as a Member of Parliament. First of all, it's a great gratitude because this is a fantastic time you are inviting us to talk a very crucial topic. Actually, the entire planet is affected when we talk about climate change. And actually, it is also another opportunity to appreciate God that He has given us a chance to be today with the team from all different parliaments in the world, purposely for this issue. From the side of Africa, it's actually, I would start by saying that though we are talking about climate change being a global issue, Africa is the most affected continent in the world. And it is also good, I mentioned here, that when we talk about emissions, it is good to realize that Africa has contributed less than 44% of the emissions, but it is also good to realize, to know that the African countries are taking the matters of climate change as a reality and taking different actions. It is also this platform that I should say that even the country I come from, Kenya, it's one of the most affected countries when it comes to the issues of lands, when it comes to the matters of water scarcity. I'm happy to be today in the UK where you don't mention about water scarcity. In Africa, that is our daily voice, that water is scarce. A woman can wake for many kilometers searching for water. Girl child is also getting a lot of challenge, but she has to wake up to go and search for water long. And when I'm talking about sourcing even for that water, it's not quality water. There's a lot of challenge when it comes to the water scarcity, in the quality and also in the quantity. We also have a big challenge in Africa and especially in Kenya. When we talk about renewable energy or when we are talking about clean cooking, as in Africa or probably Kenya itself, the biggest challenge we have is deforestation, where the poor people have to go and cut trees for them to get the charcoal for cooking and the firewoods. Therefore, when I'm in this meeting, the first thing I emphasize when it comes to the capacity building, it is the capacity building must be devolved to even developing countries so that the other members of parliament in the entire world can get a lot of information. How do we unite as a planet on the matters of also sharing the matters of technologies where we can also save this world together as a team. It is also another platform that I would raise to say that another also challenge we are getting in Africa, it is the food scarcity. Because also when we talk about agriculture, there's also a lot of land matters. Therefore, the climate change is actually affecting all of us, and it is now cross-cutting in the entire sectors in the country. It is also another challenge that today gives me a platform to remind one another that when we unite as a planet and we be, as you have talked, the last point, the matters of financing and the matters of transparency, actually we are going to save this world. And also another thing, can we also devolve in Africa what we are saying, whatever we are talking in our platform like today here or whichever place, let us take it to the grassroots. When you go back to Africa, probably even in Kenya where I come from, the 70% population is in rural areas, and the composition is of women and the children majority. And when we talk about climate change, it is also good we tell one another the truth. The most people affected in the entire world, it's women and the children. When we see floods, when we see when we see the landslides, when we see the drought, when we see the famine hitting different parts of the country, the world, actually majority of the people affected. Therefore, also in this platform, I would be raising that when we are talking about the members of parliament being inclusive, let's also talk about the serious matter on climate and gender. Let us have serious consideration of women to be in the decision making, even in these global meetings. Because when there is no presence of women, we rather tell one another as colleagues, parliamentarians in the world, when there is absence of women, then there is no voice of women. And women carry children and also carry you men. I think we should agree on that. I might have taken a lot of time, but it is also good to say that I'm also impressed that the President of the Republic of Kenya has made a serious, has taken a serious decision, and it was announced here in COP26 that Kenya has made a decision that we are going to fight deforestation in the country. It is also good to note that in Africa, Kenya is the first country to have a climate change law, that we have a Climate Change Act 2016. Therefore, also Kenya is leading in the majority of things. It's also good to note on this forum that also the decision for Kenya as a country is they are interested to meet the 100% renewable energy. Currently, we are roughly at 73%. Therefore, it is also a good platform to share the success stories we are having, and also we are also as a country leading as number one when it comes to the wield power in the country. Therefore, we have a lot of issues we can share because also as developed nations, we are ahead of us when it comes to the matters of transport, when it comes to the matters of good practices in agriculture, when also it comes to the other technologies, and that's where I'm still pushing. That's the way forward. Let us continue uniting, push for inclusivity for all of us, and also the positions for women when we are talking about how do we make this planet more better and making the world more better for all of us. Thank you so much. I don't know if I've talked so much or maybe I was to be added more time, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Charity. You're well within time, so not a problem there. I've just been reminded to use the microphone, so my apologies. I hope all of you could hear me here. But this is really for the benefit of the online audience, because of course we do have more than 200 people who are joining us online for this fantastic session this morning. So as you said, Charity, it's very important to remember the equity aspects of this. Equity internationally, between and within countries, domestically also. And also the role of women, of course, women, children, the elderly, very often the most impacted, the most vulnerable populations in their countries, but very often the ones who have the solutions. And we have many examples of women leaders who have been leaders for quite some time on the environmental and climate and justice nexus. And just from your country, of course, not to forget, Wangari Maathai. And Wangari Maathai was, of course, she started as an activist, as a professional, became a policymaker, was a parliamentarian, became a minister. So this is the pathway for women leaders in Africa. Globally, women account for only 1/4 of parliamentarians. That's a shocking statistic. And I'm really pleased that on this panel, if we had all been parliamentarians, we would be quite the reverse of that statistic, and Dean would be in the minority. So we are at COP26 calling for a 50-50 vision, and Globe is committed to supporting the campaign aims of She Changes Climate, and we are endeavouring to ensure that in all of our events we have 50-50 male-female representation, participation, and we call on all of our parliamentary colleagues to show that commitment to gender equality. I would like to pick up on an important point, which, given that this is an international dialogue, is very relevant. And that is the role of parliaments, not just in a national context, but in a subnational context and in a regional context. Because, of course, parliaments such as in Kenya are part of the East African Legislative Assembly. Until recently, the United Kingdom was part of the European Union. And it's these regional assemblies which are also playing a unique role. The East African Legislative Assembly, for example, after Paris in 2015, was one of the first parliaments that directly adopted in an integrated manner, not just climate commitments from Paris, but the commitments under the Sendai Framework on disaster risk reduction, which had been agreed on as part of the Sendai Framework in March of 2015. So really showing the need to have integrated framing of laws and policies. So that's at the regional level. I would invite you to reflect on that. And of course, because we're in Scotland, to remember that there is a very distinct parliamentary framework in the United Kingdom. And this, again, is not apparent to most people outside the United Kingdom. And even within the United Kingdom, people do not really understand the notion of reserved powers and how it is that Scotland has its own Climate Change Act, I believe the Climate Change Act of 2009, which leads to a real distinction and possibly at sometimes tensions between agreements made at the national level and those made at the subnational level. Now, I would invite you to reflect on that, particularly because at this COP, there is a very strong emphasis on the importance of multi-level governance. So we're talking about coherent climate governance, taking into account policy making, regulation and lawmaking at the national level to understand how it then cascades down through institutions, through governments at the meso level, at the provincial, territory level, and importantly at the local government level, because right now there is a mismatch. There's a disjoint between powers which are enjoyed at the national level and those at the subnational level. Powers, in particular revenue and tax raising powers, mandates to act on climate change. So that is a relatively long way of getting into the next round, which is a discussion amongst ourselves. And after that, we're going to open it up for a discussion with the audience here and online. So, Dean, if I can turn to you for your thoughts on those issues.
Thanks very much, Malini. Yeah, a number of issues there. I think within Scotland we have the Scottish Parliament that has it's a very powerful Parliament with devolved powers. Some of the issues and powers surrounding climate change also sit with the UK Parliament. You touched on local government. I think that is a very important area of government that will need as much help as we can give as possible, because it's all very well having national strategies, but the people on the ground are the local government officials who have to implement the policies. And we need to, it's partly about finance, but it's also about expertise. And I think a couple of the panel members mentioned earlier, we touched on the level of finance that will be required, but the level of expertise probably doesn't get as much attention, I think, as it deserves, in terms of the skills required, in terms of the expertise on committees, the expertise of parliamentarians, what support they have. I think that's crucial. I also think on the international context, there is a growing sense that the developed countries have to take responsibility. The mobilisation of finance, it looks like, I'm hoping that the target of $100 billion a year is going to be reached during COP26. That will help, but I think in terms of the developed countries helping or looking at this as a global solution, it's not just about finance, it's about technology, it's about technology transfer, it's about making sure best practice in whatever country is adopted across the world. So I'm hoping that this COP26 won't only agree to mobilise that $130 trillion of finance, but it will look at this as a global problem with global solutions. And I think that's, Charity mentioned working across Africa, the Great Wall, the Green Wall initiative in Africa, I think is a great example of countries across part of the region working together. I think that's got an enormous support, and I think it's got financial support, but it's also got political support. So I think there's that element of finance, technology, cooperation. All of these together are going to be essential if we can address this issue globally, but also within nations. So I hope that addresses some of the issues you raised.
Thanks very much. That's a really helpful start. I think we'll get into some of the questions around devolved administrations also in local government further in the discussion. If I can turn to you next, Tahseen, for your views on the issues raised.
Yeah, thank you, Malini. And just following up, I mean, it's a huge subject matter, powers at national and subnational levels, and who holds those powers and who's holding who to account. I think the way that I like to explain this is by way of example, and from an international perspective. The work that we've been doing in parts of Africa, in Malawi and Zambia, for example, through our research, we've come to a really deep understanding that access to clean water, as my colleague Charity had mentioned, is not a basic human right. And that is fundamentally very, very hard to digest. But it also is reflective on how the strength and the power of people's voices is really important here, and the power that's held at grassroots level, and to what extent that can translate into changing powers and positions at subnational levels to then really on to national levels. And I think, it's a difficult one, because at the end of the day, we need to address and tackle climate change, but those policies need to be driven not just from top down, but bottom up. And this is about who holds those powers and who's holding who to account. So that's by way of just reflecting on examples that are happening in different parts of the world, and perhaps it's something that we can learn from, and reflect on how we develop our national policies here in Scotland. And it reflects on what I was saying earlier on, that power is held by people, individuals in society. And we need to get better at understanding those needs and wants and desires and aspirations for many, many different people, and make sure that that is reflective at policy at subnational and national levels.
Thanks very much. And of course, we haven't talked about net zero very much, but I turn to you now, Jenny, because across the world, we've had countries which have adopted net zero commitments and have issued climate declarations, but so have hundreds, if not thousands, of cities and regions. And of course, the Climate Change Committee has been in the forefront of acknowledging the role of the subnational and local governments. And I wonder if we can draw you out on some of the guidance that's been provided and some of the thinking within the committee on this issue of subnational engagement.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the first thing to say is that I really welcome what Dean was saying about the the benefits of having such a strong force in Scotland, really showing the way in so many areas. So that makes our job easier, because we can then hold up many excellent examples of good practice in Scotland, but also elsewhere, and say to the UK government, look, here is what you can be doing. You know, there are lots of great options, lots of great ideas, and here's the evidence of what works. So that dynamic is really, really helpful. But I'd also agree that local government has been neglected in the UK. I think it's an area, I mentioned areas that have gone less well. I think it's an area where I would reflect that our advice has been less successful at really penetrating through. We published a report in 2012 which said that local authorities need a clear statutory duty on climate and need the funds and resources necessary to put in place the policies and the programmes to back that up. One of the big areas that I've been thinking about, for instance, is how you decarbonise heating. And that's so interesting because it really makes sense to look at a different range of solutions, many of which are location specific. So you can look at the role of low carbon heat networks in cities, also potentially some use of hydrogen, so converting over the natural gas grid, but probably in locations near industrial clusters or carbon capture and storage infrastructure. So very locationally specific, but also there's a need to plan with across the economy, with industry, with power sector, etc., with transport. And it's basically impossible to see how you can have that mix alongside widespread electrification without a clear role for local and regional decision making, and also recognising that as government representatives, many of the local government and regional representatives are more trusted than many other institutions that interact with the public. So both that necessary locus of action, but also that relationship and that trust, I think are two things that we need to tap into.
Thank you. And you just reminded us actually that guidance came out in 2012 when you were calling for statutory engagement, was statutory mandating of local governments on the climate change issue. So almost a decade, folks. So unfinished business there. But I would like to draw you in, Charity, on your reflections from a Kenyan perspective and African perspective on the issue of devolution, and in particular what good practice there is in Kenya or in the continent more generally that we can learn from in terms of engaging at the subnational or the regional level.
Thank you very much. Let me start by just explaining how Kenya operates. We have National Assembly, that is the Parliament. We also have Senate. We also have what we call county government, That is, the entire country is divided into 47 small counties, and those counties are led by governors. Therefore, the senators lobby for funds for the county government. And in the county government, we have what we call MCAs, like they are member of county assemblies. They are just elected per ward, the small ones, so that if a ward has a population of roughly 30,000 Kenyans, it has a ward. Therefore, you will meet in the entire country. We have like a national assembly for the members of parliament. We have senate. We also have that county government, which is led by the governor. Therefore, any decision which is made in the country on top, there's also division of funds which goes direct to the county, then it is devolved to the ward level. Then if the county assembly is to make a decision in relation with anything concerning environment, they also have that powers. As National Assembly, we do all the national policies. And let me also say that what we are doing as a country, in relation with the climate change, we have taken it as a very serious matter. That's why you hear that Kenya has the first legislation in relation with the climate change. Therefore, in the parliament, we have even changed. We are also mobilizing our colleagues in other parliamentary committees, because we have different committees in the National Assembly. Therefore, we also lobby from them to set aside amount of money in relation to do anything which concerns environment, like lands, like you go to agriculture, like you go to the tourism sector, where we are saying we want at least also to make tourism a selling product in Africa or in Kenya. We still have to push our colleagues to make sure that there is a budget set for this. As a committee in Parliament and the Natural Resources, myself being a member, we lobby for funds to make sure that our top priority as a nation is to make sure that we also go back to the Constitution, which says we have to increase the forest cover. Now, what do? We lobby for serious funds, we budget for it, and that's why from 2018 we aim to lobby for a national tree campaign. And also we aim to start an action as a government to stop logging until we continue planting more trees. And that's what I was saying here, that I'm happy that it has gotten a lot of political will. In East Africa, we have been trying to lobby ourselves with other colleagues so that we can come together, because you see the matters of climate change affect all of us. It can affect Uganda, Tanzania, there is an extension of Rwanda, whatever can be done in Kenya, probably it can affect one another. Therefore, what we were proposing in our last meeting, where we had some East Africa members of parliament, is how do we create a more better platform to make sure we lobby all the members of parliamentarians in Africa. We come together as a voice, and we also try to make sure that our regional blocks like East Africa, North Africa, South Africa, Western Africa, how do these regional blocks be empowered so that we can share what are the best practices, what nations can unite and what they can achieve. Those are actually most of our serious issues we are pushing, because we all of us suffer most of the common issues. When we talk the matters of the floods, you have seen it in Africa, it's so much. Water scarcity is our storytelling. Therefore, those are some of the serious practices we are taking. Also, when it comes to the matters of the topic of clean cooking, we still have a big loophole. That's why I said, in Africa, we need to take an action. We need to unite. We need also to unite with you developed countries so that we can see what are these best practices, so that we can also save our continent as we save the planet. On top of that, also it is involvement of women, because it is true, we accept that in Africa culture, a woman has been a nobody. And thank you for mentioning Wangari Maathai. You have seen the way she had to struggle for her to be even a star in the world. It is because there has also been a culture that women are like They are nowhere in the place. Therefore, we also appreciate that when it comes to the National Assembly and also the issues of Senate and the counties where the governors rule, we push for the inclusion of women. And when you go to the government of Kenya right now, the best practice which has been implemented by the government, there is no work which are done without 30% for the women, youth, and the people with disability. Therefore, those are some of the practices we are doing. And also we are trying to see what other policies, what other motions we can bring in the parliament. Because we were saying also we can come up with a different concept that can we also empower these poor children in primary schools at their early ages, that we can teach them that there is climate change. We can also start practicing some 1, 2, 3. Therefore, as a member of parliament, through what we call constituency funds, we still have a small percentage for environment. Therefore, for me as a member of parliament, as a champion of conservation in the country, I have initiated a program of empowering schools, planting trees, making the country green, so that we can also have a local idea to sell to these young children. Those are some of the few practices we are doing, and also the campaign we have also started of making sure that there is reduction of poaching of the elephant and other tourism attracting wildlife in Kenya and in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charity. And actually you have, without me even having to ask it, answered the question which was raised online, which was how can parliaments work better together? And that was asked in the UK context between the Scottish and Westminster parliaments, but you provided a really informative illustration of how that's working in the region, in your region itself. We have a number of questions which are coming in online. And of course, we've got the set of issues that we're discussing around the table also. But Tahseen, I'd like to just invite you to pick up on this issue of expertise, skills development, capacity building, and access to all that by legislators, because that's a common thread which is running through this morning's discussion. And if you can share your thoughts on that, and what I'd like to do next is just open it up to discussion for those who wish to raise questions or comments in the audience here. And we'll also include as many of the questions that are coming in online. That's okay, we have until 10:30, so another 20 minutes of some good discussion. But your views on the aforementioned issues.
Yeah, no, thank you, Malini. I think, I mean, the issues of expertise and skills and development, I take it the question is for and amongst parliamentarians. I think it's such an important aspect to be acutely aware of the conversation, of the evidence base, of the arguments, of the rationale, of the thinking behind what goes into some of the funds that are being rolled out, particularly the climate justice funds and other aspects at government level. And I think there are certain, I understand and we all recognise that, you know, the day job is packed. And it's finding that time and the space in the diary amongst all the various commitments to take part in those kind of like capacity building and skills workshops, and thinking about not just doing it, but conducting those meaningful engagements in a way that's constructive, but that generates genuine conversation. So we're not talking about sitting and doing schoolwork and home exercises. The best way, I think, to get knowledge across is by conversation and interaction. And I think that's the fastest and easiest way to do that, but with a basis of what it is that we're trying to get across to help parliamentarians make more effective and better decisions. So it's like I said, it needs done, but we also need to think through how that can be done in the most creative and effective way, bearing in mind the diary pressures that everyone completely understands of that parliamentarians have.
Thank you. And I'm sure that others around the table can point to some really good examples of how that's taking place. Your committee in particular, Dean, the NZ committee, which has been very active since it came together just a few months ago.
It has. We've had a very large number of distinguished witnesses and guests at the committee, including yourself. Thank you very much for making yourself available. And I must say the engagement we have with the expertise is tremendous. We've never had any issues at all about engagement, about people making themselves available for us. I'd like to make a distinction between parliaments, national parliaments, and local government. Parliaments make policy, and in that respect, they certainly do need expertise. They need to listen to citizens' assembly. They need to listen to those who are most impacted by climate change. That's the role of Parliament, and absolutely there's limited bandwidth. We need as much support as we can get. I think that's essential. As I said in my opening remarks, committees are a very good avenue for that, a very good channel to influence government thinking. The distinction I'd like to make between parliaments and local government, and I think there is an emerging theme here, local governments implement policy. And if we were to look at where there is a real need for expertise, I think it is at local government, because if you look at the responsibility of local government, it is local transport policy, it is planning consents for renewable and for other projects for the transition to net zero, it is electric vehicle charging stations, clean air, heat in buildings, that massive transition of Scotland's housing stock, all sit, in terms of implementation, sit with local governments. So if you were looking, certainly on a parliament level, we do need expertise, absolutely. The bigger ask and the bigger requirement, I think, is at the local government level, because they have, for the past 18 months, been very busy, understandably, with COVID, dealing with COVID, helping small businesses, helping the NHS deal with the health implications of COVID. But if we really want to achieve those detailed, on-the-ground targets, the ask we are making of local government is huge. And I think as policymakers, as everyone else, I think for me, that is one of the challenges we're going to face in terms of, for example, just electric vehicles, for example. I think the Climate Change Committee said that there has to be 30,000 charging points across Scotland. At the moment, there's 2,500 charging stations across Scotland. So if we're serious about that behaviour change, about people, and the national objective is to reduce car mileage by 20% by 2030. For that to happen, we need 30,000 charging stations, and in turn, and this is by no means a criticism, it's an observation, we need local governments to implement that. So that requires resource, expertise, money, real focus from parliaments to help local government do that. So to answer your question briefly, expertise is welcome across all areas. The expertise required at a parliament level is slightly different when it comes to policy making than it is in terms of expertise at local government level, which is about the implementation.
Thank you very much. And I'm really pleased that you spoke to this point, because I think that there is an emerging clarity about the importance of engaging with and empowering local government and resourcing them. And I know that this has really been a theme in the UK, driven by bodies such as UK 100. And I know that this is, in Scotland, that debate is really landing nicely. So I think it's certainly, I see it as one of the major, outcomes of this conversation, that there is a unanimity around the importance of local government and parliaments working together, given their respective roles. I'd now like to open it up to all of you who are here. If you'd like to make a comment, please make it briefly. I'll take questions in clusters of 3. If you have a question, please let us know who you wish to direct it to. So the gentleman over there was first, the lady over there second, the gentleman next to her third.
Firstly, thank you very much for all your insightful contributions. It's really interesting. I'm the convener of the Rural Affairs, Islands and Natural Environment Committee at the Scottish Parliament, and we work very closely with Dean's committee. We've got a massive remit for a 9-member committee, and whilst we're ably supported by clerks and academics, many of who are here today, capacity is a real issue. So not only do we need to scrutinise and hold government to account, we also, as Dean has said, need to be the catalyst to drive new, ambitious policies. And we've heard about sub-government or sub-national, and I'm lucky enough to come from a local authority, and I'm very proud that they've set the target to be the first local authority to become net zero. But my question is, do we have the capacity at both national and local government levels to deliver new policies and the timescales that we have? We know we need to go further and faster than ever before. So how do we build capacity within nations to ensure we can do that? And do we need to very quickly think about how the frameworks we have currently need to change to deliver that capacity expertise to deliver net zero in the timescales we know we need to?
Thank you for setting up that challenge. We'll take the next question, please.
Hello, yes, it's Elizabeth Layton, Secretariat with the Climate Emergency Response Group in Scotland. And I had a question about the Climate Assembly process that has been raised, and what the panel thinks about the prospects for enhancing the involvement of those types of deliberative processes for not only determining what a net zero pathway could and should be, you know, what does fair mean to people, but also the just transition plans that have been committed to in Scotland, and how we could benefit from that process of not only so-called taking people with us, but actually improving how policy is developed.
Thank you. And the gentleman next to you.
I'm Hassan. Mine is a comment. I'm also a parliamentarian from Kenya. I just want to compliment what my colleague has said in terms of some of the good practices that we have in our country. We have two houses of parliament, as he said, National Assembly and also county assemblies. At National Assembly level, we make the policy for the entire country. And we also have developed a national policy. And then the county assemblies are guided through the Senate, and also sometimes we invite them to National Assembly to learn from us so that they can make local laws. The Constitution allows them actually to make laws related to environment and a host of devolved functions. There are functions which are fully devolved, like agriculture is fully devolved, livestock sector is fully devolved, water is fully devolved, and so on and so forth. In terms of skills for parliamentarians, as policymakers, definitely members of parliament and also members of Senate require their capacities to be built technically. In our case, actually Parliamentary Service Commission, which is responsible for National Assembly and also the Senate, has an institution specifically for training our staff, our clerks in different areas. They also make arrangement with experts from universities and also regional training institutes like ESAMI, for example, East and Southern African Management Institute, where we are trained. For example, in our case, we are trained on different areas, for example, climate change, all these issues that we are discussing here. Because not every member probably has learned that in colleges or in universities. And for us to make good laws, we need those skills. So these are some of the ways in which our capacities are built. We also sometimes, arrangements are made by Parliamentary Service Commission for us to visit other jurisdictions, especially within the Commonwealth, where we learn from our counterparts within Africa and also outside Africa. Places like Canada, we've been here severally, to UK, and so on and so forth. So these are some of the things that, and then one unique thing that we have in our case is that at counties, we have laws and also we have adaptation funds in a number of our counties, especially the counties in arid and semi-arid lands, where a portion of the budget that is allocated to devolved unit is set aside for mainstreaming climate change issues and also for guiding, for a secretariat to guide mainstreaming or mainstreaming of climate change in all the sectoral plans and so on and so forth. I think this is also a good practice from our country. In terms of our role in ecological emergencies, again, we've had situations where before our new constitution of 2010 came into force, there was a lot of destruction of ecosystem. And some of these ecosystems serves, more than one country. For example, we have a water tower called Mau, which serves the famous Mara and also Serengeti in Tanzania. When we destroyed it as Kenyans, it affected Tanzanians. So as parliamentarians, we were able to provide budget for Ministry of Environment for restoration of Mau, and the restoration has improved the lives and livelihood of Kenyans, as well as the Tanzanians, and so on and so forth. East African Legislative Assembly also plays a part in terms of helping us to look at transboundary issues, issues that cut across more than one country, and so on and so forth. We also have IGAD, in terms of things that link us with Somalia, South Sudan, and also Ethiopia, and so on and so forth.
Very, very informative, and I think in particular the ways in which you're working across borders on implementation of national environmental and climate priorities. So just a time check, we have just a few minutes left. We also have questions which have been raised online, so I'm grateful to for the 2 questions that have been raised here. But online we're getting questions which relate to the role of lobbying, a very current and topical issue, but how to avoid particular lobbyists having advantage over others within the deliberative parliamentary process. Another issue which has come up online is that of improving policy coherence and coordination amongst the committees themselves in Parliament. So, and a third really, which is the role of young people and climate education and engagement. And if anybody wants to refer to this unprecedented and innovative effort, The Moment, which took place engaging elected representatives and children and young people across Scotland just last week. You're very welcome to speak to that also. But I'd now like to close off this session and invite each of the panelists in turn to respond to the questions that they most felt they wish to provide a response to. So starting with you on my left. Thank you, Dean.
Thanks. A number of great questions. I'd like to spend a lot of time, but obviously we're up against the clock. Question on capacity, yes, absolutely. We're up against capacity constraints, but I think COVID showed what's possible when we take a whole-of-government approach. We developed vaccines in a record amount of time, and if we can deploy that same focus in terms of the technology required for net zero, I think that would put us in a good place. Capacity can also come from the private sector. What I mentioned earlier about that joint working, massive expertise and knowledge in the private sector. The gentleman from Kenya mentioned a very good point about mainstreaming education here, not just for parliamentarians, but I think every member of society should learn about climate change, what it means for them. And that brings me on to the Climate Assembly point. Absolutely vital, I think, massively useful exercise. I think also because of the issue of behavioural change. It's partly education, it's partly messaging. We can have a top-down national government advertising campaign about behaviour change, but behaviour change will also have to be driven from a sort of local, bottom-up community level, and I think climate assemblies can really help with that because there's only so much top-down messaging can achieve. So I hope I've covered most of those issues there. And I think generally I would like to just finish off in terms of training and education. I think training and education from the youngest children to the oldest adults is going to be essential here. If we really want policy to make a difference, people have to, in terms of a just transition, people have to both buy into it but also understand what is asked of them. So I think education will play a key role in all of this.
Thanks very much. Clear and concise there, Dean. And we are up against the clock. So, Jenny, your thoughts, please, the questions so far.
I'll be very quick. The one I wanted to focus on is climate assemblies. I absolutely welcome that question. I think we really do need to look at how we can bring more deliberative processes to bear, so at a local level especially. I used to work in regeneration, community regeneration, and we used to talk about how there's a pyramid. So you start with consulting, that's the very basic, then above that there's engagement, and then above that there's empowerment. And empowerment's a big word, but basically it means putting in place the mechanisms to enable people to decide. And things like participatory budgeting, such as the gentleman mentioned. I was really pleased this week to see the declaration on deforestation come out, and one of the things that was so important about that is the recognition of the role of Indigenous people and Indigenous knowledge. In looking at Guatemala, for instance, there's the Maya Biosphere Reserve, where you can just look at the evidence and you see how effective it's been devolving the guardianship of those forests to local communities, and much more effective than the national parks, actually. So yes, absolutely super important. And I'd just like to end with this recognition of the role of young people, which I think has been so wonderful as part of this COP process, and is just something which continues to delight and inspire me.
Thank you very much. Very to the point and to the moment. And to yourself, Tahseen.
Thank you, Malini. And I'm just going to very quickly just talk about the capacity question that was posed. The question was, do we have the capacity? And I would flip it and ask a different question in terms of what capacity is actually missing right now. What are the knowledge gaps that are missing right now? How can we map that out very, very quickly? And then how can we look at plugging that knowledge gap? Because as the question was, we're up against a time frame. The targets have been set and there's a job to be done, and it needs to be done pretty quickly. So my suggestion, my strong recommendation is to get that piece of work done pretty quickly. And in terms of plugging that knowledge gap, and we recognise much of this is about societal and behavioural change, but it's also about bringing the science together with the social science. It's hard science and social science together, and that is so important in these conversations, because if it remains fragmented, we're never going to reach our targets. This is about all disciplines coming together and getting that knowledge across to who needs it, whoever needs it the most, parliamentarians right down to our young people. And I also think we need to get much better at educating our young people better through schools, not just at primary school but high school and onwards. It's so vitally important. So there's a massive job to do ahead.
There is a massive job to do, and I'm going to ask our final speaker, Charity, to please put it all together and your final thoughts to the questions raised and your final remarks, which will close this session.
Thank you. My last comment, it's just a reminder to all of us as members of parliament in different countries. Our main objective being legislation, oversight, and the presentation. I think in the position of presentation, I would combine my point with the smart point you have raised about it is bottom-up model that we are going to make it possible even for all the grassroots people to be reached with what we are seeing. Also, I wish to comment on that point of education. It is now our high time that we put ourselves more energy, that education is not only going to the youths, let us also go to everyone, including our children, our women, who are most affected anytime we have climate change impact, whichever country we have. And lastly, I was interested with the point which was raised by the first question. Do we have the capacity? I think with this platform as parliamentarians, I hope we can create a good, and we continue, let us not get tired of mobilizing one another, lobbying one another for one another, so that we can ask ourselves that smart question once again. Are we having capacity? What kind of capacity? Because we totally differ, a country to another country. Probably in Africa, we might be talking about the challenge of finance, the challenge of expertise, the challenge of capacity building. Maybe another country has another big challenge that probably it is the biggest polluter, and maybe does not have even the technology capacity. Probably there's another country which has smart people who can come up with ideas for us to reduce that emissions. Therefore, my last point is to say, yes, we can. Yes, we can. Let's unite. We have good points with good faith. We have a goodwill. We are so much excited that we have seen the big nations are now saying they are ready to donate funds. It's also high time we do more partnerships. Let us do more cooperations. Let us also go back into our continents. Let us empower the regional blocks. Let us devolve it. I'm sure we are going to do something. We have a chance to save this planet. Thank you very much. God bless you so much.
Thank you very much to Charity, to Dean, to Jenny, and to Tahseen for helping us end on such a positive and energizing and optimistic note. We need it. We started the day with a provocation, and we ended with an acknowledgement of the importance of consensus, of mainstreaming and just digging in and getting the job done. So I would like to give a special thanks to all of you who are participating here in person, to those who've joined and contributed online, to all of the staff here and at the Scottish Parliament who have helped put this event together. And please don't forget, the conversation did not start and end here. It is continuing. It will continue online on Slido. So please do share your thoughts. You will be getting an email to follow up on that. And of course, there will be, as I mentioned at the beginning of the event, a report which will be coming out listing some of the key recommendations and suggestions which came out of today. So thank you once again for your contributions. It's been a delight to chair this session, and see you all at COP and around. Good luck to everyone. Thank you.